I understand the problem was with the broadcast system this time, so that's now been resolved. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I was talking to you about some of the evidence that we'd heard,
Yep.
really to ask if that altered your views. So we were looking at slide 21, and we were talking about the category of possible blow to the shoulder or equivalent. And we've heard some evidence in this inquiry that Mr. Bio was brought to the ground, and it's described as some sort of like bear hug, like wrestle thing to basically knock Mr. Bio off balance and take him to the floor. And then another witness, PC Walker, said, "I just brought my left arm across my body and shoulder charged him with my left shoulder with a fair bit of force." Now, taking those descriptions as they are from the witnesses, is there anything within those descriptions that would alter your views in relation to that third bullet point?
Yeah. So, as I said, a blow to the shoulder or equivalent, which would be falling onto a shoulder. If someone was brought to the ground in a bear hug, if you like, then the impression that I have from that is that the arms would be pinioned to the side. And if that was a correct impression, then if you fell down onto your shoulder, you'd have no way of preventing your shoulder hitting the ground. You couldn't put your arm out. Not the bear hug itself, nor do I feel a sort of shoulder charge, which I guess wasn't shoulder to shoulder, but we've heard that there was no bruising in the shoulder area. But I could imagine a situation where by pinioning the arms to the side, the first bit of you that hit the ground would be your shoulder. But then again, one might expect to find bruising and tissue damage if that were the case.
So in considering that as an option, it will be important for the chair to consider the evidence of Dr. Shearer as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And then finally, the category which you've marked as green likely, can you talk us through this, please?
Yes, at the time I was told that there was a fight between Mr. Bayo and his friend. I wasn't told what would have happened during that time. And similarly, I imagined that more than imagined, I knew that the police had brought Mr. Bayo to the ground. And in both of those situations, I could imagine an arm being pressed out and then the force being delivered up an outstretched arm. I've put or equivalent because I wondered whether the same level of force might be induced by hitting somebody. So rather than falling onto an outstretched arm, your outstretched arm then hits somebody with force, particularly if they were on the ground and weren't able to move, or if they did move and you hit the ground. And with what I knew at the time about the way in which the events had been portrayed to me, that was why I felt that was the most likely, and it would also explain why there didn't seem to be any bruising anywhere else.
So if a person fell onto an outstretched arm or punched a person or an object or the ground, would the force travel up the arm and potentially fracture the rib? Sorry, I'm pointing to my right arm, but it would be the left.
Doesn't matter, yes. Yeah, that was how I saw it, and why when I looked through all the different causes, I felt that was the most likely.
And if someone again was punching the ground or an inanimate object, it may be that you would expect some sort of injury to be observable on their hand of some description?
I think if you hit the ground with your fist with that amount of force, or even somebody else, you might get damage to the knuckles. Again, this is beyond my professional expertise, but I can see that might happen. Whereas if you hit somebody with a palm, in this sort of motion, or fell onto a palm, the hands are usually quite sturdy, and you could imagine them just impacting and the force being transmitted without causing any overt damage to the hand itself.
And again, the chair will have to consider any evidence from Dr. Shearer about the absence of any knuckle injuries or injuries to the hand that might be consistent with a punch. Or
Yes, I was only working from the information I had. Dr. Shearer will have much more experience as well as knowledge of these things.
And you were looking at all the possibilities that could have caused this type of fracture.
Yes, that's what I was asked to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we move on to slide 22, please? And then we asked you to look at some other, in light of the information we have now, we asked you to look at some other possible or hypothesized causes. So there are a number of unlikelies marked here, categorised in that way. Let's go through those first, please.
Okay.
Let's look at handcuffs first.
Okay. The forces required in putting on a no, let's start somewhere else. If we were looking at trying to translate the forces that have been described as causing these fractures into other settings, then would putting on a pair of handcuffs give that level of force of falling onto an outstretched arm, banging your shoulder down onto the ground? I didn't think that was likely.
And we have heard evidence that handcuffs were, there was an attempt to apply handcuffs to the wrist area. We've heard some evidence of marks from Dr. Shearer. But in terms of the force required to cause a fracture in the first rib, is there anything that you could read in the papers or see in your slides that would give an indication of that level of force?
I just couldn't see that the forces of putting on a handcuffs being, however forcefully they were applied, as being the equivalent to a large man falling onto an outstretched arm.
Thank you. And then sticking with the category of unlikely, you specifically mentioned press up, and we've discussed that already.
Yep.
And
as I say, that was all based on the site of the fracture. Yeah.
yes. And then you've mentioned the word squeeze there. Now, before I ask you to comment on this, we have a written statement from a consultant, Dr. Carey, who has not yet given evidence. So if I may, I'll read out something that is in his statement, but subject, of course, to the fact we've not actually heard his specific evidence yet. And he talks like you, that the fracture is a very uncommon sight. He has said, I've been asked to consider the method of restraint deployed by PC Walker in bringing Mr. Bio to the ground. 2 separate scenarios have been described. The first, where PC Walker performed a bear hug manoeuvre whereby he wrapped his arms around Mr. Bio's body and took him to the ground. The second scenario is PC Walker performing a shoulder charge. I've put those both to you. The first scenario could have caused the rib fracture, since this is the bear hug, since the squeezing occurring, which is a form of restraint. The question is whether that would be capable of causing a rib fracture, as opposed to the mechanism of severe pressure being applied to the chest in a side-to-side fashion. And I'm interested in this concept of squeezing. And I'd wonder what your comments are in relation to that idea that some sort of squeezing could have caused a fracture in the first rib.
If I could go to the image that's on this
Yes,
on this slide.
Let's go back to that.
It's the one that's up at the moment.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant the previous images.
No. This is another one of those images where there is skin and muscle outline superimposed onto the skeleton. And the red arrow marks the site of the fracture. The collarbones have a very interesting function in that they are designed to push the shoulders back. and they form a brace across the shoulders. That's their primary function. So in the position in which that picture is, and I've put a purple double-headed arrow below that, the collarbones themselves are there to prevent the shoulders coming inwards. And the fracture, as we've seen, is to the rib below the collarbones. So putting your arms around the shoulders would be prevented from causing squeezing because of the two collarbones. The normal way in which somebody would grab somebody and squeeze them is under the arms. And if you look under the arms, you can see that there's a lot of other ribs there. And yes, that is a way in which ribs can be damaged, but I couldn't envisage how an isolated first rib fracture could be caused in the absence of any fractures to any of the other ribs in that position.
Thank you. And so in the absence of any other fractures, either lower down the rib cage, did your view remain the same in relation to this squeezing manoeuvre, that remains unlikely?
I think so for those two reasons. If somebody was squeezed up around the shoulders, then the forces would have passed through the clavicles and through the collarbones, and if they were squeezed lower down, then the forces would be passed through the lower rib. So force sufficient to fracture the first rib would need to overcome the resistance of the two collarbones or the lower ribs themselves. And if they weren't damaged, I couldn't see why an isolated fracture of the first rib would occur.
Thank you. And the next option on the final bullet point here is CPR, and I think you've also indicated that's unlikely. You come on to that in the next slide.
Yes.
But I wonder if I could ask you a couple of other questions before we just leave this slide. First of all, you've talked about fight and you say possible. I don't want to lose sight of that. Yeah. And when you say fight, what was this in connection with?
This was the group of outcomes that I alluded to of somebody hitting the ground while they were fighting, or hitting somebody who was on the ground and couldn't move, and the forces being directed up the arm. And we've covered the fact that one might expect there to be some injuries to the outsides of the hands, or alternatively some sort of something in the description which would fit that. If, say, somebody was lying on the ground and they were hit in the head with sufficient force to be transmitted up to the up along the straight arm, what would have happened to that person who was being hit? Was there a description of somebody, Mr. Bayou, hitting the ground because he, at some time during a fight, he might have missed the person and hit the ground? It was those sorts of things that I thought, well, it is possible, but I haven't heard, and I still don't think I've heard of either the friend having the sorts of injuries that one might expect if you were hit very hard, or any description of Mr. Bayou hitting the ground.
Well, let me give you a description that we do have available, and you can tell us if that changes your view at all. This comes from an inquiry statement that we've received from Mr. Bayou's friend. For those who wish to know, it's SBPI 00071, but I won't ask for it to be put up on the screen. But he describes an altercation with Mr. Bayou. This is prior to him getting to Hayfield Road. That Sheku sucker punched me from behind. He punched me on the head. I was half in, half out the door, and I stumbled after being punched. He started charging towards me. I seen him start running towards me. I started running when he picked up the washing line pole. He literally chased me all the way around the back of the house and with the washing line pole, a wooden one. I thought Czech was hallucinating. He did throw the washing line pole, but it missed me. He pushed me onto the floor in a neighbour's garden. I think I fell over a wall. He was on top of me. He was throwing punches into my head. I tried to protect my head. He did throw a good few punches. That's a description that's available to the chair to consider. Is there anything in that that would be consistent with what you've described?
If I understand correctly, then the friend was lying on the ground and was being punched, which I think is one of the scenarios that that I've sort of said could lead to the same sort of forces going up the arm. The arm would have to be straight when he was hit, rather than bent in that sort of way. But yes, that is something that could happen.
We've no other details other than
Sure.
what I've given you. And then I'd also like to ask you about some other evidence that we've heard about a part of events as the restraint was taking place. We heard evidence from PC Peyton about his use of a baton during part of the restraint. And I'd like to put a description to you for comment. I picked up the baton, this is PC Peyton. I picked up the baton and put it across the boy's bicep. I had the baton across the boy's bicep. I was holding both ends of the baton, and I was in a push-up position with my whole body weight, with the pressure on the baton over the boy's bicep, but he was still struggling. He says, I know this is not a trained method of restraint, but in the circumstances I was trying to bring him under control, to assist with keeping in control, and for handcuffs to be put on him. Now, in terms of that description, insofar as that was given, was there anything there that would indicate to you possible to cause a first rib fracture?
I don't think so, but there's no mention of how Mr. Bayo was counteracting that force. I just don't know from the descriptions that I've given you from heavy lifting and so on, whether trying to push your arm out. It sounded as if Mr. Bayo was on the ground and the baton was across his upper arm, not his shoulder, but his upper arm. And if he was trying to push in this direction, would that be the equivalent to lifting a heavy weight? I suppose it might be. As I said, it still comes down to the site of the fracture. I haven't seen a fracture other than in the green area that I drew, resulting from this sort of heavy lifting. Would it be impossible? I think I've said already that it wouldn't be impossible, but it's just I haven't seen anything and described other than fractures in a different site to the fracture that Mr. Bayo suffered.
So would that be in the unlikely category that you...
I think so, yes. I mean, what I'm trying to do, I think, is to paint a picture of which of the causes that we know about can cause this fracture might be the most likely. And obviously I still favour falling on an outstretched arm or the equivalent.
And then we also have another version in relation to PC Peyton's use of the baton. PC Peyton had a baton and passed it through Mr. Bayo's left arm to try to pull Mr. Bayo's left arm out from under him in order to get both hands behind Mr. Bayo's back for him to be handcuffed to the rear. Mr. Bayo's left arm was under him as he lay on his left-hand side. Now, I appreciate that's quite a short description, but is there anything in that description, this comes from PC Walker, which would give you any cause to consider this could be...
I don't think so, no.
Right. And then a third version from a PC Good. He kind of had the baton like under, trying to rotate the arm around. it's going under to try and rotate the arm around. It would end up between the shoulder blade and the body. Again, a very limited description of PC Peyton's use of the baton. But is there anything in that at all?
No, I can't see anything in that.
Thank you. So we were looking at the final bullet point, CPR, and you've described that as in the unlikely category. Could we look at the next slide, please? And then we'll talk to you about CPR. Now, I think we said at the beginning of your evidence today that the Crown had said one of the possibilities they were interested in you considering was that this fracture had been caused by CPR, and that there may have been evidence at that stage that someone had heard a rib fracture during the course of CPR. Can you describe to us what we see here?
Yes. In my original slide, the bottom left one presentation, the bottom left one was animated, and it showed how by doing CPR the middle of the chest is compressed, but there was no movement in the area shown in red, which is a rough area where the fracture was. So if we look at the other two images, the purpose of CPR is to compress the heart in order to pump blood. And as a consequence, pressure is placed over the heart. And the top left-hand image, again, the red marks the site of the fracture. The image shows hands held in the correct position, so interlocked, but over the heart, and you can't actually see the heart because of the position of the hands. So what the right-hand image does, it's got quite a lot of information in it. The right-hand image with the purple circle shows roughly the area where your hands would be compressing, and behind it in a sort of orange colour is the shape of the heart. There's also some other orange lines, some of which are dotted, but they represent the outline of the lungs. But we're really interested in the heart, which is immediately below the breastbone, but slightly to the left. And so that's where the pressure is exerted, though you cover, as you can see from the top left-hand picture, a greater area with your hands. The pressure is focused on that point, squeezing the heart in order to get blood to be pumped. The very best CPR fractures ribs, and we have to accept that because that's the way in which you're now getting the heart to be compressed. And at the top of that same diagram, you can see that the top number, 75%, represents the number of cases in which rib fractures occur as a consequence of CPR.
And is that where we see the green?
Right, and I'm sorry, I've only just noticed that there's actually a green bit missing as well. But the ribs that are fractured are from the second down to the sixth are the most common, and 3, 4, 5 and 6 are the most commonly fractured ribs. And if you look at the way in which forces would be moving outwards from compressing the chest, and you're having to push the breastbone down very hard in order to pump blood because you're squeezing the heart, then you can see why that might be the case. And as I say, there should be a green mark over the left third rib as well. I apologise that I haven't put that in.
No, not at all.
Sorry,
no, carry on.
5% is the number of cases where the first rib is fractured in CPR. And this is by combining lots and lots. I did a meta-analysis for this, so combining a lot of data and putting it in there. I think it's pretty fair to say that is always associated with fractures elsewhere in CPR. I have not been able to find any evidence of descriptions in the literature of first rib fractures alone being associated with CPR. So I would have expected there to be other fractures. I would, if the CPR had been had caused fractures as a consequence of the pressure that was being exerted.
So certainly possible for CPR to cause a fracture in the first rib, but
Not an isolated fracture.
the fact it's isolated is
It's
very
really
significant.
important. Yes.
And it's that isolation of that rib that has made you think CPR is an unlikely cause.
Yes. Yes.
So if CPR had caused fractures, and it very well could, it'd be more likely to be accompanied by fractures 3 to 6 in ribs.
Yep.
3 to 6.
Yes.
Thank you. And then can we move on to slide 24, please? And you've said here, new data have provided new insights. What, we're obviously moving on to the next section of your slides. What does this next section deal with?
There are certain key elements of the analyses that I've performed. One of those relates to the timing of the fracture, and in particular, the timing, two things. First of all, the timing relative to the time of death, and secondly, the absolute timing of the fracture. And particularly there, I have built a reliance on the information that I had available at the time about the aging of osteocyte necrosis. So I go on to discuss those two things, and I mean, without wanting to cause any distress, one of those will be at what time did Mr. Bayou die? The other one is, what do we now know about osteocyte necrosis? And some part of what I've been able to establish has come from information that the inquiry team have given me now that you've had an opportunity to speak to a number of different witnesses. And I think on the next slide, but I've put into context why I thought that was important.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide, which is 25.
Yeah, this is the first two of these, the clearer timeline of events and the toxicological analysis, are the information. There's extra information that has come to me now from the inquiry team that I didn't have at the time in 2017, and I think they were very important because I was being asked what the timing of the fractures was in relationship to interactions that Mr. Bayou had with other people, and I've been assured that prior to 6 or so hours before his death, there was nothing happened to him that could have given rise to the scenarios that I've described as being likely or possible ways of causing a fracture of the first rib.
Can I give you a summary of my understanding of the timeline, and just so that we can put this into context for people? So we have heard evidence from a witness called Naomi Rhodes, and she described seeing a fight between two men, Mr. Bayou and Mr. Zahid, his friend, and describes that as about 6:30, 6:45 in the morning on the 3rd of May 2015. And we know that the police arrived, the first van arrived at Hayfield Road, seen on the CCTV, at roughly 7:20 in the morning. that Mr. Bio was brought to the ground and restrained shortly after that time. By 7:25, he was unconscious but breathing still. And then at 7:29, or by 7:29, that CPR was being commenced because he was unconscious and not breathing at that stage. The ambulance arrived at Hayfield Road at 7:33, and he was attended to by the paramedics and taken to Victoria Hospital. They continued at the hospital to endeavour to resuscitate him. They used a thumper machine in that part of the event, and but he was not pronounced life extinct until 09:04. So that's my understanding of the sort of rough time scale that we're considering as key events. And does that accord with your understanding of?
Yes, there were one
what
or
you've been
two
told?
other things that I took away from the notes. The first is that I think it was a doctor called Dr. Pickering who was in charge of resuscitation. And there was a report, I'm not sure if it was by one of the police officers, of feeling a pulse on Mr. Bio when he was in a break in the CPR. The paramedics also reported that when they were going to shock him, the shock machine, I think, generates an ECG as well, that they found electrical cardiac activity, as if the heart was pumping spontaneously. And I think when Mr. Bayou arrived at the hospital, there are also reports of him having spontaneous cardiac output, which means his heart was beating, and it was. And then there was a suggestion by the senior doctor that maybe throughout all of this period there was evidence of cardiac output. And I looked at that quite carefully, and I felt that was an important observation. While all of the time that Mr. Bio was being resuscitated, before he got to hospital, there was considerable difficulty in intubating him, and that because his teeth were very tightly clenched together. But once he was in hospital, he was seen by a proper anaesthetist and so on, who was able to intubate him, and that during the time that he was being resuscitated using the thumping machine, the anaesthetist was putting, I think, pure oxygen, but whatever, into his lungs, and was also recording a pressure wave from a major pulse. And I can't tell you what that is, but it did mention in the notes that I saw that pressure wave was measured at between 70 and 140 millimeters of mercury. And normal cardiac output is 120 millimeters of mercury. So from what I could see, there was some spontaneous cardiac heart activity at times, at least during the period between starting CPR and getting him into hospital. And after all, that's what CPR is about. It's about getting the heart to beat properly again. So that meant that it was good CPR, and that the very careful way that, as I read the notes from the hospital, were that there was that the CPR that was carried out was successful in the sense that it was pumping blood around the body, and nowhere did I find out exactly when that stopped, but I have made an assumption that they carried on doing everything that could be done until they declared Mr. Bayou dead at 9:04. And to me that's important as someone who ages fractures, because fractures are aged from the time of death. And there's always a discussion about how good CPR is at extending life, if you like, by itself, in terms of how much blood is being pumped around. But if, again, as I say, I've read the notes correctly, then there seemed to be very good evidence that the CPR was working very well at pumping blood around the body. And therefore, it would be reasonable now to put the timing of death at 09:04.
Thank you. And that is the point from which you will start to calculate the age of the fracture.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. So, sorry, I interrupted you on this particular slide 25.
You actually taken me to my point of the management of collapse and arrest.
Right. And then you deal with toxicology analysis?
Yes, I've expanded on that in one of the later slides, but I was told, for instance, that in 2017 that there was that the part of the toxicological analysis showed that alcohol was present. I know that now is not the case. And I've been racking my brains to try and remember, and I can't, and I haven't mentioned it in my report, of what was known about the amount of the anabolic steroid nandrolone that was in the system. And I think that, in light of new things that we've learnt since 2017 about the very bottom bullet point, which is osteocyte apoptosis or necrosis, I think that now takes on considerable significance when it comes to aging the fracture as closely, the closest possible time that the fracture may have been to the time of death.
Right. So you were given additional information from the inquiry team
Yes.
about the timeline of event and additional information about events in the hospital in particular.
Yeah.
You were given further information about use of steroids and toxicology information, and information about the absence of alcohol in the urine samples. And then since 2017, there's been further developments in relation to aging fractures and osteocyte, either necrosis or apoptosis.
Yes.
Thank you. And then can we move on to the next slide, please? So this is 26. Talk us through what you've said here.
Yep. This is really what we've just discussed. What I was told was that there was no suggestion of an altercation or anything which could have led to the sort of forces that we've been talking about prior to the incident with Mr. Bayou's friend. So I think we can therefore, if we're looking for a cause of the fracture, then I think we can bring the timeline and therefore the means of the cause of the fracture down closer to the time of death.
So from the point at which that altercation took place?
Yes, if there was nothing beforehand, then I've said, well, in that case, then there was nothing beforehand, so we brought it down, and that, of course, was the timing furthest. I'm sorry, it's a very clumsy way of putting it, but it's the only way I can do it. The timing furthest away from death that the fracture could have occurred. I've said 6 hours, but it looks as if we can ignore.
Miss Rhodes described it as between 6:30 and 7:15 in the morning.
Yeah. So we know, and if death occurred around 9 o'clock, then we're now limited to that time.
And is this an example of where the actual evidence that the chair hears and the context in which it's given is a very important element of assessing everything?
Absolutely. Everything I've said has to be put into to the context. Equally, what I've said has to come into the context as well.
Yes,
so, yeah.
of course.
And we've discussed why I needed to know when the heart stopped pumping. And that is both spontaneous pumping and successful CPR. And as I say, when I read through the notes, I sure I saw that there was a systolic pressure was recorded by the anaesthetist. The heart was being pumped, the lungs were being inflated and inflated with pure oxygen. So any blood that came from the right side of the heart through the lungs to the left side of the heart would have been oxygenated. And the CPR was effectively replacing, and effectively in every sense, replacing spontaneous pumping. So that's really what that slide's about.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide, slide 27.
Yes, the toxicological analysis mentioned the presence of MDMA and alpha PVP in the bloodstream. These are psychostimulants and can have, it's my understanding, though again, of course, I'm talking as a bone and joint pathologist, not as a toxicologist or whatever, that these drugs can affect pain perception and can be behaviour changing. What really interested me was the next set of information about synthetic androgens.
Could I pause for one
Sorry,
moment?
yes.
Sometimes we do require to have a break in the afternoon, and it's now 3 o'clock.
If you think you'll finish within about 15 or 20 minutes, then I think we could carry on.
Would you be happy?
Yeah.
We'll carry on.
Yeah, very well.
Sorry, I just like to check.
Yeah.
So you've said that this section, synthetic androgen, nandrolone, this relates to steroids.
Yes, the androgens are steroids. They're in a group of steroids known as the sex steroids, and they have similar effects on men as estrogens do on women. And that's really where the interest has stemmed from. There are men who develop osteoporosis. And just as women can develop osteoporosis beyond the menopause, men develop osteoporosis as a consequence of lowered androgens. And there are two things that I felt were important in the more recent literature from 2017 to late 2022. The first was that the mechanism by which osteoporosis occurs in men with low androgens is that there is excessive amounts of the normal processes of apoptosis of osteocytes. So removing androgens from elderly men leads to an increase in osteocyte apoptosis. So androgens affect the way in which osteocyte necrosis, as I call them, or what should be better than osteocyte apoptosis occur. It is just not really known whether the same effects of androgens work in younger men. However, in older men, if you give nandrolone, which is the most used of the synthetic androgens, in men who have osteoporosis and osteocyte apoptosis, you can reverse the process using nandrolone. So not only is an absence of androgen leading to increased osteocyte apoptosis, giving androgens reduces that process. And it struck me that one of the things I needed to consider was that how that might affect the timing of the osteocyte apoptosis that I'd seen. And when I came to think it through, I'm afraid I couldn't come to a conclusion. An argument might be made that by inhibiting apoptosis, you would delay the onset of the appearance of apoptosis in bone. The alternative was a slightly more circumferential way of looking at this, and that is that we know that we now know that the amount of apoptosis in osteocytes in all the way through the male age range perspective reduces So it increases, so that in infants apoptosis occurs relatively soon, and we'll be talking about the evidence for that, and that gradually as you get older the amount of apoptosis increases. That could well mean that what you're doing by giving nandrolone is actually making a man, maybe even a young man, but there's no evidence for this, a young man's cells younger. So you're driving the osteocyte into thinking that it's a lot younger than it was, and that could then be interpreted that a traumatic cause of apoptosis comes on more quickly, because apoptosis associated with fracture is there to initiate healing responses.
So for a young man who's taken nandrolone, one of these steroids, and sustains a fracture when he's living, ante-mortem, will the osteocyte necrosis appear more quickly than it might otherwise have done?
And that's what I can't work out, but the answer is yes, I could come up with I think quite a logical sequence of events that would mean that the apoptosis appeared earlier because the cells were beginning to behave more like the cells of a younger man, child, infant.
Is it fair to say that that's based on your experience and views, but it's that science itself hasn't quite reached the stage of proving that?
No, that's quite true. There's a lot of androgen usage amongst weightlifters and people in these positions, who are taking them as bodybuilders, and there's a big desire amongst the doctors who run clinics for looking after these people, because they get lots of other things as well, like liver cancers and so on, or liver tumours. That they would like to know much more about what the effects of nandrolone are. But you can imagine that that's very difficult because people don't like to say they've been on steroids, how long they've been on, whether they're taking them regularly or so on.
And you've said there may change the time closest to death that apoptosis might first be seen.
Yes.
And in terms of the change, it would appear more quickly.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
And there's one more piece of evidence, which is on the next slide, that might shift a view in that direction.
Let's look at the next slide, please. So this is 28. This is your second last slide.
Yes.
Can you talk us through this, please?
Yeah. I said right at the beginning of giving my evidence to the inquiry that I was concerned about the number of people in the country who are in a position to be able to help age fracturing. And I therefore went through an analysis of the cases that I had looked at. And I looked at 3 different groups. Infants. And infants are a good group to look at, one because a lot of the work that I do relates to aging fractures in infants who may or may not have been abused. Children and adults. And the problem with adults is that they span all these different ages, and age is one of the things that we know changes the way in which cells work, not just bone cells but all cells. It's part of the aging process. In order to get a scientific publication accepted, you have to show that you have sufficient cases to make analysis worthwhile. And when I analysed all my cases going back over 32 years in 2019, I only really had enough cases to make that viable in infants. And by that I mean describing what you see down the microscope against time. So how a fracture heals against time, knowing the time at which the fracture occurred, and in most of the infants at which death occurred, And again, you can imagine that the situation in infants where you're looking at a lot of the infants are abused, then getting a time when the abuse might have occurred is very, very difficult indeed. So any case that fell into that category had to be excluded. And so I had 171 cases where I knew the age of the fracture and could therefore say, at this age of the fracture, these are the appearances that I see down the microscope. At this age, they're these ones at this age. And that enables you to say what's the earliest that you have seen a certain event, and then the latest. And quite a lot of these events, you see something and then it disappears because something else takes its place. And when I, just to finish that off, in children, there are very, very, very few children who come to post-mortem. It's just the way it is. And in adults, I mentioned that I had funding for research from the Medical Research Council to look at fractures at many different times. But and in my clinical work, I was also sent fractured hips and so on that have been removed. But the age range from 16, 18 went up to nearly 90. And so although I had rather more fractures in the adult group, because of this age range, I couldn't conduct a proper scientific study. And the one thing that was noticeable from that was that I did not have a case in an adult where osteocyte necrosis had been seen before 2 hours. But I think there were only 32 cases as opposed to 81 children's cases.
That's 2 hours from death.
That's 2 hours from death, yes, yeah. But when I analysed the data for infants, I found that there was a significant number of cases where the injuring event was known to have occurred an hour from the time of death. And in those, I saw osteocyte necrosis. And that was really the other piece of evidence that led me to that rather circumferential look, that's the wrong word, but I can't remember what the right word is, sorry. To say, well, if you can make osteocytes in adults younger by treating them with nandrolone, could you also push the time before death back towards that of an infant? And there are lots of reasons why that may or may not be the case, but it was certainly one of the things that I thought about. So, we know that this gentleman was taking steroids. It was found in his urine, I think, or his blood, and the question was, would they have affected the time at which osteocyte necrosis occurred? If they did, is there any evidence that osteocyte necrosis ever could occur in fractures that are less than 2 hours old? And the answer is yes. In the children, in the infants, it can. So if his osteocytes were being made younger by giving him nandrolone, then could his osteocytes have behaved as if they were in an infant? And nobody can answer that question. It's impossible. But at the same time, an argument, I think, could be made for saying, well, that's certainly a question that's worth asking. And in this case, of course, it has a lot of implications because of the now knowing the time at which death occurred, in the terms that I mean by death, but it's pumping oxygenated blood to the tissues, then it does bring it back into a different time frame, whereas previously all the timings that I gave would have meant that the police officers would have, the interactions with the police officers would have been right on the cusp of the timing.
So when we're looking at a 2 hour period where you have some evidence in relation to adults, would that be the period between 7:04 and 9:04?
Yes.
Would it be as precise as that?
No.
Or? No.
No.
And for infants, if we were talking about infants, would it be the equivalent of between 8:04 and 9:04?
Yes, but again,
Not as precise as that.
Yeah, but round about an hour is, is a good timing to say for those, and round about 2 hours for the...
And is that another reason why the circumstances and the context of what's happening are still essential matters for the chair to consider?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. And then can we look at your final slide, please? And I wonder, this is your views on the fracture from this year. And I wonder if you could just take us through those bullet points,
Okay.
please.
All the evidence points towards this gentleman having a solitary left first rib fracture, and that has a lot to say about mechanism. I have no doubt that this occurred in life, and that is evidenced by osteocyte necrosis and by the presence of hemorrhage, which I demonstrated with the glycophorin A staining. It must have occurred less than 6 hours before death, and I've timed death at 09:04 for the reasons that I've given, and we have already discussed the fact that 6 hours is probably too far. Now we know the circumstances, but again, that's not my decision to make as to when that occurred. But I was not told, and I don't think the inquiry has heard of anything that happened that could have led to the sorts of events that we've talked about for this fracture occurring before the fight with the friend. The nandrolone effects and the data from infants, and I hadn't analysed my data until late 2018, early 2019, would indicate that the certainty that I had that the fracture had occurred more than 2 hours before death must now be looked at differently, because there is the effects of nandrolone could have moved the osteocytes back to a similar time frame in terms of osteocyte apoptosis caused by fracturing, could have moved that back before 2 hours. And we've discussed the mechanisms by which this could have occurred, and I can see that there would be events that occurred during the altercation with the friend and with the police, which I've timed at roughly 2.5 and 1.75 hours prior to death, could have led to the sorts of forces that are necessary to fracture these bones. And I felt, from what I'd heard and read and been told, that this was more likely to be an indirect injury, so not due to somebody actually physically hitting that bone. And from everything that there was and the descriptions that we've seen of what happened, all in the heat of the moment and so on, I still favoured a fall onto an outstretched arm, again because of the absence of soft tissue injuries in a lot of these places, and the situation of fractures that are associated with muscular activity. But again, not from my experience, from the limited amount of material in the literature.
Thank you very much. Could you give me one moment, please?
Of course.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? Well, Professor Freemont, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for the care you've taken to make this evidence accessible.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to rise now, and you'll be free to go.
Lovely. Thank you very much.